Good morning. Welcome to another program, Veterans for Peace. It looks like it's going to be a rather interesting winter, to say the least. The West is on fire. The South is being flooded and hurricaned out. Tornado season is coming. And I think we're going to have a real New England winter, a lot of power outages. Global warming, yeah, Trump's right, fake news. So the climate people are now saying it's a lot worse. Anyway, that's just a little prologue thought. I'm David Ross. I volunteered twice, served 2 tours in Vietnam as a medic with the 1st Infantry Division. Things I saw, I almost can't live with. I mean, unless you can read books, you can watch newsreels, television, old television footage, you can, all these different things. You have no idea what war is like unless you've actually been out there. You've heard the explosions, you've heard the bullets, you've heard the screams, you've been up to your elbows in guts trying to save people's lives. You've looked at little children, just little kids dead. War's not the answer. There's got to be a better way. And we're fighting 7 or 8 wars now, depending on whether you count one of them as a real war or not. We've got troops all over the world, and we have people flooding in from the Central American countries. Why? Because for generations we have ruined their economies. We've placed dictators in. We've murdered people that represented the peasant class, represented democracy. We've made their countries so unlivable that now they're coming here. And you know what? Should open a border and take all of them, because we created this mess. So I'd like to introduce my co-host, David Ransom. You give a little background, Dave?
Well, I'm Dave Ransom, and speaking of New England weather, I just came down from the roof this morning trying to shovel the ice off so it won't collapse. I think we're going to get more of that when we've been out trying to cross-country ski at the 800-foot level. Whoa, there's a little bit of powder on top, there's a ice layer, there's powder underneath, and then an ice layer on the bottom. And my snow thrower won't go through it. I have to use it like a plow. So anyway, we're hoping to have a great film this morning with Dennis Mueller, one of our members. And maybe, Dennis, you can give us a few words on yourself and how you came about doing this. What's it about?
Okay,
it's a race to the bottom or a race to the top?
No, I'll explain. My name's Dennis Mueller. I'm a veteran filmmaker. I've done various films, Howard's In You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train, Peace Has No Borders, with my colleague Deb Ellis. This film is called From Ike to Trump, Race and the GOP, as in race. So I came to do this it was my expression of what's going on. What can I do?
Yeah.
You know, I'm not, I don't command an audience that I can go out there and speak. But I do have this skill as a filmmaker. So the great filmmaker Emil D'Antonio once said, the history of the world can be found in the CBS archives. I contend that that's changed, and that the history of the world can be found on YouTube. So I set out to do a film about the racism that exists in the GOP, and how did this come about? I mean, I'm aware of the contradictions of Ike. He sent troops to Little Rock. His heart wasn't really in it, but he did do it.
Yeah.
He did do it, and there's no getting around that.
That's right.
And that's how change occurs, when people of good conscience do things that's a little bit against their own grain, but for the good. So what happened to that GOP? How did it become the party of Lincoln? And of course, I'm aware of even the contradictions of Lincoln and now. So that's what this film's about. It follows the takeover by various foundations and explains how these foundations are descendants from the John Birch Society. It also goes into Trump and his background, in discrimination cases, and his father's membership in the KKK. And we look at Rupert Murdoch, and our local angle is we look at Charles Murray, the author of The Bell Curve, and his recent visit to, well, not that recent, a little over a year now, his somewhat recent visit to Middlebury College and the uproar that it caused. First, I think, should watch, we can watch the film. Yeah.
We're eager.
There's one thing I'd like to throw in. There's really two Americas. This was something I came to a conclusion. It was just always a little below my consciousness. There have been two Americans since before the Civil War. Basically, the liberal North and the more conservative South. The South, when it left the Union, I mean, this whole thing of the rebel flags and the Aryan nations and the Klan and the arm and the sword and the shield and the covenant of the Lord, these hate groups like that, they're terrified that the U.S., that the population is at some point not going to have a white majority. And actually, that is happening. And that's demographics. There's nothing you can do to stop that. But take Johnny Reb. Most of the people in the South didn't have mansions, didn't have plantations, didn't have slaves.
Yeah.
It was actually a relative minority that had all this. But yet the poor white, the term poor white trash, the poor people of the South, the working people of the South, because of the propaganda, they signed up for defense of the South, defense of the homeland, defense of our women and children, and our way of life, and all this caca, really just caca.
I'd like to add one thing. This film is not about the South per se. It's really about 1% racism. The racism that exists in foundations, the racism that exists at our institutions of higher learning, Ivy League racism, the lack of the press actually raising the questions that I raise. I'm one person. The press does not raise these questions. We never hear about the real reasons behind voter suppression, how awful it really is, how it is very much like a poll tax, how it is very much like the literacy tax, the literacy questions. So, at any rate,
the
that's
whole point
let's
of
start
what I
film.
was trying to interject was simply that there's sort of always been these two counter-facing political cultures in this country, but the racists were always a little quieter about it, felt a little suppressed, a little bit put on the fringe. And now under Trump, the FBI says hate crimes are at a 15 to 20% increase over all recent history over the last couple of decades. Trump has really enabled the worst people, the worst organizations in this country to come to the foreground. And they're comfortable walking down the streets with their Nazi flags and KKK hoods and all of this, because now it's like Trump's made this acceptable. The Republicans have made this acceptable. It's not acceptable to me.
Okay, can we start?
Well, in Connecticut, we used to say, we're the only people in the United States who know how to speak English. When you get on the Appalachian Trail, you get down to Maryland, if you're going north to south, and instead of saying Appalachian.
Appalachian. Well, let's start the film.
Yeah.
Okay.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
On September 24, 1957, President Dwight David Eisenhower sent 1,000 troops to carry out the law. The Supreme Court said the entire strength of the nation might be used in any part of the land for the security of all rights entrusted by the Constitution of the United States. including the rights of 8 black students who wanted to enter a public school in Little Rock, Arkansas.
The basis of our individual rights and freedoms rests upon the certainty that the President and the executive branch of government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decisions of the federal courts, even when necessary, with all the means at the President's command.
One group that did not like the Brown versus the Board of Education decision or the burgeoning civil rights movement was the John Birch Society. The society was founded in part by their opposition to the Brown decision and the civil rights movement. The radical right would change the mission of the party of Abraham Lincoln and oppose the civil rights movement. The change began when Barry Goldwater, in the name of states' rights, condemned the Kennedy administration for sending federal troops to Oxford, Mississippi in 1962.
James H. Meredith is formally enrolled at the University of Mississippi, ending one chapter in the federal government's efforts to desegregate the university. The town of Oxford is an armed camp, following riots that accompanied the registration of the first Negro in the university's 118-year history. Much of this film record was destroyed when our cameraman, Gordon Yoder, was attacked, but he did salvage pictures of Governor Ross Barnett at the scene. The governor fought the court order long and bitterly before modifying his stand, saying Mississippi was overpowered by the federal government. President Kennedy appealed to the students and to the people of the state to comply peacefully with the law and bring the crisis to an end. Even as he talked, riots were breaking out in Oxford.
In 1963, Fred Koch, one of the founding members of the John Birch Society, wrote a pamphlet called A Businessman Looks at Communism. In it, he described the civil rights movement as a communist plot.
In the past hour, we have offered only a brief survey of the material that's available to support the charge that the civil rights movement, as we know it today, is simply part of a worldwide movement organized and directed by communists to enslave all mankind. There are hundreds of additional witnesses and thousands of additional facts to testify to the communist involvement in the American civil rights movement, but the limitations of time prevent their inclusion here.
In June of 1964, 3 civil rights workers were abducted and murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi. The victims were Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner. At the time of their murders, they were attempting to get African Americans in Mississippi registered to vote.
If you talked about organizing any activity that defied the status quo of segregation, was clearly you were at risk, and that it could lead to death. And there were cases across Mississippi where there were young, especially African American men, that ended up dead and under very suspicious circumstances.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I want to take this occasion to talk to you about what that law means to every American.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
Goldwater, along with future Presidents Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush, all opposed the bill. In the 1964 campaign, Barry Goldwater sought to tie Southern discontent with Northern racism in a commercial that was pulled because it was considered too racist.
The other America is no longer a dream, but a nightmare. Our streets are not safe. Immorality begins to flourish. Violence pits American against American. We don't want this. How did it happen? Is there a reason we seem to have changed so much in so short a time?
It's in your hands, America. It's in your hands.
Many in the Republican Party opposed Goldwater's views on civil rights and the extremist views of the John Birch Society. One of them was Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who denounced Bircher extremism at the 1964 Republican Convention.
There is no place in the Republican Party for such hawkers of hate, such purveyors of prejudice. There is no place in this Republican Party for those who would infiltrate its ranks, distort its aims, and convert it into a cloak of apparent respectability for a dangerous extremism. And make no mistake about it, the hidden members of the John Birch Society and others like them are out to do just that.
I have no bitterness, no rancor at all. I say to the President as a fellow politician that he did a wonderful job. He put together a vote total that's larger than has ever been gained in this country. Well, I've sent the President the following wire, which I think will be available for you if you don't have it now. To President Lyndon Johnson in Johnson City, Texas. Congratulations on your victory. I will help you in any way that I can toward achieving a growing and better America and a secure and dignified peace.
In 1966, the House of Representatives introduced a new Civil Rights Act. It sought to end discrimination in housing and in private schools. The Act of 1968 were designed to alleviate some of the problems that segregated housing had caused. But Richard Nixon and Roger Ailes decided to exploit the racial problems and ride a wave of discontentment to the White House.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. Let us recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
Nixon pointed to the Democrats, pointed to the chaos that happened at the convention, especially in the streets, but also inside the convention hall. And he took what was ultimately a police riot and said that it was proof that the Democrats could not control the people of the United States. They were the reason why the U.S. was falling apart, and it was time for the silent majority to take back their country.
Once in office, Nixon still had the liberal judges of the Great Society to contend with. Nixon soon appointed conservative judges, including Philip Morris attorney Lewis Powell, the author of the Powell Memorandum.
What happened in Cornell was an African-American, the Black Student Union, I guess is what it was, took over the administration building and flashed guns. Guns which they swear, by the way, were never loaded, but it made for what they call incredible optics. And this led to university administrators across the country essentially freaking out. And also, it also led to people in the more in the non-academic establishment to start thinking seriously about, quote unquote, taking back the universities, because in their mind the universities had become hotbeds of revolution. The Powell Memorandum was a probably maybe a 9 or 10 page document that was sent out to the American Chamber of Commerce, and it was argued that the leftists, the liberals, the culture warriors, what the right wing calls cultural Marxists, that they were had taken over the universities, and it was time for the business administration, the business world, to fight back.
The Powell Memorandum was very effective due to the immense sums of money of the corporate class. The existing American institutions could be now molded to the conservative point of view.
Now, many of our Christians have what I call the goo-goo syndrome. Good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
A number of reporters and scholars have written works that have shed light on the workings of the shadowy networks of the right-wing billionaires like the Koch brothers. But until now, there's been little understanding of the origins of the ideology behind this assault on democratic institutions. That led our next guest, Nancy McLean, the William Chafee Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University, to look into the ideological foundations of this movement. And what she uncovered is deeply shocking and troubling, the subject of her explosive book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. Really happy to have you on.
Great to be with you.
So for the first part of this discussion, let's start at George Mason University, where you stumbled upon a remarkably unguarded trove of documents belonging to the late Nobel Prize-winning economist James McGill Buchanan, and what you were able to piece together about his role in the Koch brothers' plans to reshape America and its democratic institutions. Talk about how you came across this and what you started to piece together.
Well, James Buchanan had been on my radar from some historical research that I had done on the state of Virginia's massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education in the late 1950s, and I became intrigued with him. And when I finally was able to get into his private archive at George Mason in 2013, I found all of my suspicions confirmed about the ways that his ideas were being weaponized by the Koch donor network in order to effectively disable our democracy. And to do things like privatizing public education, inflicting these radical cuts in necessary social services in the country, changing constitutional law, all kinds of things I was able to find in that archive.
Good evening, everyone. It was the most politically sensitive case before the Supreme Court this term. The ruling has dealt a severe blow to the Reagan administration and to private schools that discriminate. As Jeff Kamen reports, the justices have ruled the government is obligated to enforce a national policy against racial bias and must deny tax breaks to schools in violation.
I'm the originator of the whole thing.
January 1982. The president insists it was his idea to overturn 12 years of IRS policy denying tax-exempt status to private schools that discriminate against blacks.
There was no basis in law for what they were doing.
But the president was wrong. The IRS had routinely gratis to schools that discriminated until a 3-judge federal court ruled in 1970 that a Mississippi school that discriminated was not entitled to the tax break. But the Reagan administration announced it planned to grant tax-exempt status to Bob Jones University of Greenville, South Carolina, and Goldsboro Christian Schools of North Carolina. They were appealing the IRS ban on their exemption to the Supreme Court. When the case was heard in October of last year, the lawyers for the schools said their clients' racial policies were founded on religious beliefs and therefore should be shielded by the Constitution from the IRS action. The Supreme Court today rejected the arguments of the schools. Writing for the majority of the court, Chief Justice Warren Burger agreed with the IRS and said, "A racially discriminatory private school is not charitable. The government has a fundamental overriding interest in eradicating discrimination."
Reagan represented in a very clear-cut way reaction with a capital R. And it was very clear what he was about. He was about anti-communism, building up the military-industrial complex, greatly expanding prisons. He was about cutting back affirmative action and equal opportunity legislation. He was clearly anti-black, and he used a variety of scapegoat measures to attack the African American community.
We were making people's lives worse, particularly in the inner cities and in some of our deteriorated rural areas, so that poverty was increasing, inequality, economic inequality was widening. The kinds of social services we had for people, ranging from mental health care to drug treatment to public housing, all of these things were being cut.
In 1985, Rockwell International acquired the Harry Lind Bradley Corporation. With this war chest in hand, immediately hired Mike Joyce to run the foundation. And the former Heritage Foundation president soon hired Charles Murray away from Heritage to write The Bell Curve. The Bell Curve is not an original piece of research. It relies on the strength of its sources, and that is the problem. Its crucial chapter on intelligence uses information from Mankind Quarterly, whose funding comes from the Racist Pioneer Fund. They are quite a collection, including Richard Greer, who was the Mankind Quarterly editor at the time. Greer once said, "The crimes of the Nazis did not justify racial equality as a fact or egalitarianism as ethnically or ethically demonstrable." And Richard Lind, the discredited eugenics professor, who once said, "I think the only solution lies in the breakup of the United States. Blacks are concentrated in the Southeast, Southwest, and in the East. But the Northwest and the far Northeast, Maine, Vermont, and upper state New York, I believe these predominantly white states should declare independence and secede from the Union. They would then enforce strict border controls and provide minimum welfare. If this was done, white civilization would survive within these handful of states." And Arthur Jensen, the father of modern academic racism. Jensen was an education psychologist at the University of California and provided much of the academic respectability to pseudoscientific theory of black inferiority and segregationist public policies. One person who had no problem with all this was Rupert Murdoch. Upon writing The Bell Curve, Murdoch invited Murray onto his ship for a cruise. Like-minded spirits, Murdoch's newspaper, along with the help of Roger Ailes and his Fox network, would provide an aura of respectability for a type of racism not seen since the early 1950s.
So it's clear that people pushing racial injustice that they believed happened in the Zimmerman trial, they don't really want to talk about complicated racial problems in general. What the grievance industry does want is to divide the country along racial lines, because that's good for business.
People like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton do not deserve to be called civil rights leaders. They are not. They are hustlers and pimps who make a living off inflaming racial tensions.
Talking Points believes the day of the race hustlers is coming to an end. This we and them business gets the country nowhere.
You dress like a thug, people are going to treat you like a thug. That's true. I stand by that.
Well, say you're a cocaine dealer, and you kind of look like one a little bit.
You are not a victim. You need to stand up and take responsibility. And by the way, for all you kids watching at home, Santa just is white. Jesus was a white man, too.
Ugly rumors about Barack Obama's background began to surface during the senatorial campaign of perennial GOP candidate Andy Martin.
Attention, New Hampshire Republicans. I'm Republican presidential candidate Andy Martin. I approve this message because I'm the only candidate asking tough questions about President Barack Obama. 100 million Americans have doubts about Obama's origins. I wrote the first expose on Obama. Jerome Corsi's book asks, where is the birth certificate? Please support my campaign for the Republican Party's presidential nomination. Contribute at andymartinforpresident.com.
I can't trust Obama. I have read about him, and he's an Arab. He is not. No,
ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about. He's not. Thank you.
Donald, you and I have known each other for a long time, and I don't understand why you're doubling down on this birther issue after the state of Hawaii formally says this is the legitimate birth certificate. He was born in Hawaii. Why are you going through all of this, Donald?
Well, a lot of people don't agree with that birth certificate.
But if the state of Hawaii authorizes it, if the state of Hawaii says this is official, he was born in Hawaii on this date, here it is, why do you deny that?
A lot of people do not think it was an authentic certificate.
How can you say that if
you won't report it, Wolf, but many people do not think it was authentic. His mother was not in the hospital. There were many other things that came out. And frankly, if you would report it accurately, I think you'd probably get better ratings than you're getting, which are pretty small.
Donald, have you seen the actual newspaper announcements within days of his birth in Honolulu? For example, the Honolulu Star-Bulletin will put it up there. You see the birth announcment back in 1961. The Honolulu. Listen to me, Donald. Honolulu. Can I ask the question? Donald, you're beginning to sound a little ridiculous. I have to tell you.
I think you are, Wolf. Let me tell you something. I think you sound ridiculous, and if you'd ask me a question and let me answer it.
Here's the question. Did the conspiracy start in 1961 when the Honolulu Star-Bulletin and the Honolulu Advertiser contemporaneously published announcements that he was born in Hawaii?
Donald Trump's family history of racial hatred goes all the way back to his father's arrest at a KKK rally in Queens, New York, and the racial discrimination lawsuits brought by the Justice Department over the discrimination at their apartments. The media, by and large, has let Trump slide on the issue, but not this local television station.
Hearing from a Henderson woman who says she crossed paths decades ago with Donald Trump. As 13 Action News reporter David Schumann tells us, she says it was through her work exposing discrimination.
I've always been interested in civil rights.
In the 1970s, Sheila Morse found a way to expose discrimination in New York City. If a minority was denied something, seemingly because of race, Sheila stepped in.
They would send in a Caucasian tester and see if, in fact, it was true.
At this building in Brooklyn, New York, a black man was told there were no apartments to rent. One day later, enter Sheila. It was her turn to try and rent the place.
He greeted me with open arms, showed me the apartment, he opened every door, every cabinet. He didn't know what else to show me to convince me to take the apartment.
Sheila then revealed who she was, and she says he knew the jig was up.
What can I do? I'm sorry, but this is what my boss told me to do. I'm following directions. I'm not allowed to rent to black people.
Her visit to the boss's office has stuck with her more than 40 years.
It was Donald Trump and Fred Trump, his father.
Ultimately, a discrimination lawsuit was filed against the two men. It marked Trump's first appearance in the New York Times, and Sheila's held on to the paperwork. Trump is still answering questions about the suit, including at the first presidential debate last month.
I settled that lawsuit with no admission of guilt. But that was a lawsuit brought against many real estate firms, and it's just one of those things.
The GOP saw that demographics were working against them and began to attack voting rights.
The Voting Rights Act stands weakened. Its future subject to political rancor. How can that be? The Voting Rights Act was one of the crowning achievements of our democracy, the result of Republican and Democratic efforts. President Reagan signed its renewal when he was in office. President George W. Bush signed its renewal when he was in office. 100 members of Congress have come here today to honor people who are willing to die for the right to protect it. If we want to honor this day, let that 100 go back to Washington and gather 400 more and together pledge to make it their mission to restore that law this year.
That's how we honor those on this bridge.
Gutting of the Voting Rights Act continued in North Carolina in 2013. The catalyst for change was simple. Black people had dared to exercise their right to vote. The federal court noted that the targeting of African American voters was done with most surgical-like precision. Voter purges in Georgia, as programs by the foundations to undermine the Voting Rights Act continues.
The race for governor in Georgia is one of the tightest and closely watched in America, a statistical dead heat. So Democrat Stacey Abrams knows how important it is to turn this energy into votes.
And I need unlikely voters to stand up and show out in ways we have never done before, because our future is on the line.
Across the state, people are lining up to see the woman who has a shot at becoming the first female black governor in American history. But echoes of Georgia's history of racial division have added fuel to an already contentious race.
And what they're doing today is saying, well, any way that we can find to stop you from voting, that is what we are going to do. That is unfair. It is inhuman.
Georgia has some of the most strict voter ID laws in the country. Earlier this year, it was discovered that 53,000 people had their voting status on hold. Under the state's exact match law, names must be the same across state records. So a missing hyphen or letter could leave someone unable to vote.
President Trump continues to claim, without any evidence, there was massive voter fraud in the 2016 presidential election. And on January 25th, the new president announced via Twitter that he will ask for a major investigation into voter fraud. Again, there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud.
Take a look at the Pew reports.
I called the author of the Pew report last night, and he told me that they found no evidence of voter
Then
fraud.
why did he write the report?
He said no evidence of voter fraud.
Trump falsely claimed that a Pew Charitable Trust report supports his claim that millions of people voted illegally. The report documented millions of instances of voter registration inaccuracies. The report's authors said it shows that voter rolls are susceptible to fraud, though they did not claim it was evidence of actual fraud.
So you have people registered in 2 states. They're registered in New York and in New Jersey. They vote twice. There are millions of votes, in my opinion.
The 2012 Pew report found that 2.75 million people were registered in more than one state, as apparently are 4 members of Trump's cabinet or staff. But that is evidence of voter registration inaccuracies, not voter fraud.
With that being said, if you look at voter registration, you look at the dead people that are registered to vote, who vote.
But experts say this is largely urban myth, and so-called cases of dead people voting are extremely rare. To see more, go to factcheck.org.
The Bradley Foundation poured tons of money into these voter suppression acts. The Bradley Foundation, figuring the time was right, decided to unleash Charles Murray on the public again. However, students challenged this racist text and asked the fundamental question that was never asked by the media or academics. Why should we debate our own intelligence?
Well, it's all quiet here on Middlebury College's campus now, but that was not the case just hours ago, as hundreds of students and community members met up here at the Student Center to protest Charles Murray's lecture, and they ended up changing the course of the evening. Charles Murray speaking on the Middlebury College campus was a shock for some.
I personally felt as if my community was sending me the message that I did not belong, like as a woman and as a person of color.
Charles Murray, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! 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 Charles Murray, go away!
Middlebury College disciplined 74 students, ranging from probation to official college discipline. 48 students received sanctions from the college administration, and the remaining 26 students faced more serious consequences. The reaction of the media and academic scholars was simple. Blame the students, say they never read the book, but never talk about the sources.
All right, thanks a lot for coming on.
My pleasure.
So, I guess what I was struck by was you've written a couple of books, one book in particular that was controversial 20 years ago, 28 years ago, and when you wrote it, people, the left, freaked out, but they read the book and they responded to what was in it. They didn't like it.
Some of them did.
Some of them did.
Yeah.
At least they pretended to. When you went to Middlebury, I didn't get the sense that anybody in the crowd had read anything you'd ever written.
Basis of Murray and Hartenstein's evidence about IQ derives from disgraced British eugenicist Professor Richard Lind. Lind's studies were conducted in South Africa under the apartheid regime. These studies were done to support the South African apartheid regime and to provide scientific evidence in support of that system. There is no real way to separate the scholarship of Richard Lind and Mankind Promised from that of the bell curve. Extremists in the GOP, Fox News, and right-wing foundations have all sought to turn back the clock on civil rights. The Republican Party has turned from being the party of Lincoln to a party of racism. Recent remarks by Mississippi GOP Senator about lynchings and the governor of Florida's race has seen racial slurs as Donald Trump condemns black reporters by calling them stupid. But in the end, it will be left to minorities, women, and the young to throw these people onto the trash heap of history once and for all, and then help to create a better world.
Well done, Dennis. Wow.
Lovely.
Beautiful.
So I guess we're back.
Okay.
And a big question now is, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
One person, one vote. That's the social contract. We get to choose who's in office. Even if the media distorts everything, I mean, the only place you can get any truth today is on Facebook, and a lot of garbage on Facebook too. But there is truth on Facebook. YouTube, you can get some garbage, but you can also get some brilliant stuff. I particularly recommend Chris Hedges, Hedges. His videos will tell you in a frightening way exactly what's going on. And you can fact check him on everything. Former Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times reporter who left the New York Times because they got to a point they refused to publish some of the things he wrote, and he said, good, you don't need me. And now he works at truthdig.com. So, and you can find his stuff there. But the Burlington Free Press isn't even a newspaper. It used to be a reasonable newspaper. Now it's like, it's nothing. Channels 3, 5, 22, 44. The same thing as the national ABC, NBC, CBS. It's garbage. Who pays for it? Who advertises on it? Corporations. You're getting the corporate media point of view on all of these issues. And as I mentioned with the Koch brothers and others, a lot of these are so right-wing, they're right off the Richter scale. I mean, they're like fanatics. They're the suit and tie counterpoint to the in the streets, in your face Nazis, Klan, Aryan nation types, who may end up being their brown shirts. I always wonder if Trump's going to turn these people
I have
into
a brown shirt on today.
his brown
I have
shirt.
a brown shirt on.
So how do we get one vote, one person? My fantasy is if they find illegal voter suppression, throw the election out and make them hold it again. And those responsible, 20 years in jail, no possibility of parole. Yeah, keep on thinking, Dave.
But I don't think anything can possibly happen, and I agree with everything you said, unless the news media actually talks about voter suppression and explains what is going on and how racist it is. I mean, I'm one person, right? And I can trace back to where these foundations came from the Defense Department, from the John Birch Society. You can't tell me the news media cannot. So what we have is like Studs Terkel used to say, a national amnesia over our own history with the news media that's not going to tell us about that.
You mean Rupert Murdoch?
It's not just Rupert Murdoch. I mean, Rupert Murdoch for sure. Rupert Murdoch's, brought his the immigrant Rupert Murdoch, because he is an immigrant.
Even PBS, public broadcasting, it gives you a little more information. Democracy Now! Gives you fairly more information than PBS generally. I mean, but Democracy Now! Is the extreme of it. And there are things that they don't get right, they underreport. But that's as good as you're going to get coming through your television.
But it's not just the media.
You know, the three of us here, like Dennis says, we're just individuals. How much can we do? Hey, and we're not even the brightest peas in the pod.
Speak for yourself.
He's the brightest.
I'm kidding.
He's the brightest pea in the pod.
That's right.
We're kind of moldering down in the corners. But I mean, I've been doing this for 50 years. 50 years of writing and publishing articles, giving public speeches, going out and organizing people, demonstrating in the streets, and several times getting myself badly beaten by the police in Chicago, so badly they had to put me in a hospital. So how much does such a small minority of people have to do? The information is out there. The incumbency is on the public to get that information from us, from other activists, through participation in organizations.
I think we have to also make institutional racism an issue. Charles Murray is invited by to come to Middlebury as a scholar, horse hockey.
And it's considered
and because, as the film shows, this is garbage research. He took the worst some people from the Congo and South Africa, all, as it explained, all the studies were done by South Africans, white, who were trying to make a justification for apartheid. But Middlebury College tells the students, oh, you must debate your own intelligence. Imagine that. Would they do that would they bring someone to talk about the protocols of Zion and then tell people that they have to talk about their own intelligence? Of course they wouldn't. But to black people, it's okay. So, we have a real problem, and we need to confront institutional racism. And we need to confront it at our major institutions, like Middlebury College. I contend they punish the students, but I contend that none of them read the 13th chapter. None. And if they did, we really have a problem.
And what punishment do the people responsible for this at liberal, mostly white Middlebury College, the people responsible for bringing this garbage as a truth teller, as someone who will bootstrap their students up academically and intellectually to a grander understanding of the scheme of things? Where do these people get punished? The students get punished. The students always get punished, and the students are the bellwether for change in this country. They always have been. Whether it's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Vietnam Vets Against the War, SNCC, but all the different groups, Black Panthers. Now, I mean, the women's movement. I mean, all these groups. The truth's floating around out there, but you get these people running these colleges, running these corporations. They only have one truth. Their truth is to control everything. In that sense, they're no different than the Nazi machine in Germany in the 1930s, but they are limitations. They're taking as much as they can, as far as they can go with it. And voter suppression is a major way to do this, because one of the things that terrifies these people, especially the multi-billionaire white rich who want to pass on their largesse, largely stolen from others. They want to pass this on through generations of their genetic off-cast. And they buy truth. Money talks. That's one of the reasons why we have, no limits on campaign spending. Because money is free speech. And I'm sorry, if I can contribute $100 and the Kochs can contribute $100 million, I'm sorry, I don't consider that to be my equal voice in things. And a black person who can't even vote, who the heck is going to tell them that they're getting an equal voice in their future and the future of their children and grandchildren?
The Bradley Foundation has paid Charles Murray $2 million in his lifetime. Why? Ask yourself that question. Why?
Well, the most I ever got for public speaking was $200 from the University of Vermont, which I immediately donated back to the organization that sponsored me and got the fees. And then I lost the amount of money for the taxes on that $200. So that was, I actually paid to give that speech. Yeah, I can maybe get $100, $200 here and there. Doesn't, you know, I've never even covered travel expenses going around and giving talks. But the point of it is, what's my money compared to these people like Trump? These people that buy a 2-city block long boat with gold fixtures. I mean, just, it's a thing to kick around for a while and then sell it.
And remember
these
something,
people
Dave.
own your country. You're looking at, it's not the 1%, but you're looking at 2, 3, maybe 4% of people who control well over 50% of all the wealth in this country. How can you look at that and even imagine that there's a democracy? We're not.
Well, and remember your protege, Heron
Russell.
Member of our chapter.
One of many proteges.
And here's a brilliant girl.
And I'm the protege of many others.
Dave and Bert helped, and was it Wellesley wanted her to come. She was going on toward foreign service, training, etc. Trips overseas, back. Heron is now, by her choice, teaching in an elementary school in Boston because she wants to be where the problem really is. And we don't have to look very far down the street here in Burlington.
We don't have to look very far down this in the state of Vermont. In the state of Vermont, we had a representative that was in things reminiscent to Reconstruction, forced to resign because she was black. We have in Rutland a person who was fired because he objected to people hanging up nooses at his workplace with an arrogant, when a woman was asked about it, said, well, some people think about that. We have real problems here, and we do not confront them. We do not confront the issue of race. That's why I made this film. I made this film so we can confront these issues. And that racism does not just come from poor white people. I mean, they're victims. Racism comes from the Trump family. Racism comes from the Bradley Foundation. Racism comes from Middlebury College that invites some eugenics professor who gets his own research wrong. That's how racism works, and that exists here, and it's not in the South. You know, it's not in the South. It's here.
Right on the corner where you are.
As Malcolm X said, the Mason-Dixon line begins at the Canadian border.
The public schools.
So I don't know if Are we done?
I don't believe we are. We haven't.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky in a sense. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a slightly upper middle class neighborhood. And Cincinnati has a tremendous black population because it was the farthest southern point of the North. And as a consequence, an awful lot of slaves making their escape from the South ended up in Cincinnati and either stayed there or went on to other places. Of course, they were going off to Boston. Some were coming up through the Underground Railroad right here in Vermont. Vermont had the greatest per capita losses of young men in the Civil War of any of the states.
That's one thing you didn't hit on was the Underground Railroad.
Well,
The Underground Railroad.
There's another Underground Railroad where we got lots of active duty GIs out of the country and into Canada, and from there either stayed in Canada or
Right.
went on to Norway, Sweden, Denmark, France,
Yeah.
and other places. But I grew up having black friends, so it was like never an issue for me. A black brother saved my life, physically, literally on a battlefield, saved my life. I got knocked wacky, and he just got me back away from things, and got me back to consciousness, and took care of me till I could pick up the pace and get back to my work. But if I'd got left laying out there, I probably wouldn't have been here today.
And how do we bring the casualties home
because
today?
of my experience in the military, both in Germany and in Vietnam and in basic training and growing up around blacks, I mean, I just never had a problem. It was always hard for me to imagine how other people would have a problem with people being simply a different color. And the irony of all of this, you go way back, there's someone they call Genetic Eve. I'm not going to get into a science lecture, but bottom line is,
it's taught.
We are all descended from black people that came out of Africa, and there's no question about it. So everybody started out black, and what you see for skin and physical feature differences are evolutionary environmental adaptations to different climates and so on. It's just simply different ways that we have continued to evolve and adapt to different environments as we moved out of Africa and moved out over the entire globe. So it's sort of like, I'm sorry, everybody's got some black in them, but you're going to take that color, and that's been a basis going all the way back, way before the Bible was written, way before Moses brought the commandments down. That if people were different, you could call them inferior, and then you were paternalistically caring for them by making them slaves and overseeing them and watching out that they were fed and stayed healthy and worked like hell to make a lot of money so you could sit on your butt back at the house and enjoy your drinks and enjoy your girlfriends and enjoy your wealth. We're not different at all. The difference is so minor. In fact, the irony is there's only about 8 or 9% genetic difference between us and chimpanzees and gorillas. So there you have it. We're not different. It's economic. Follow, as Will Mueller, our mentor, put it, whenever you have a question, investigate, follow the money. This is all about money. This is all about control. This is all about we're superior, so God has given us the mandate to rule and control. And if we have to screw people out of the vote and put little nooses up to do it, well, it's just part of the party. I don't accept.
Yeah, but they couldn't screw people out of the vote unless the media and a certain quite large segment of the public is willing to go along with it. The media does not talk about this. The media doesn't do, does the media explain? Does the media explain the hyphenated letters, what that means? Any registrar could misspell something and it's thrown out. A lot of black people have hyphen names. 70% of those thrown off the rolls were black. The foreign media tells us that.
But not our own. And
will this film make it to the public schools?
I hope so. It's like, I hope it makes it and causes a discussion. And I hope it causes a discussion about institutional racism and what that means. And cause a discussion at Middlebury College. Why on earth do you call this a scholarship? This is a joke. The only reason you call it scholarship is because it's from Harvard. So,
it's not
these black people got to debate their own intelligence because a crossburner from Harvard said they should. What does that, perhaps we should be debating the academics' own racism.
And perhaps we should study Nazi Germany's studies on racism and the superiority of the Volk, the folk.
Where can we go with this,
ladies and gentlemen.
Where can we
Dave,
go with
we're
this
out of time, so I want to thank everybody for coming.
Yeah.